Hey everybody, we're back, and we're going to make sourdough in loaf pans today. A lot of people who normally love the artisan loaf still prefer to make a sandwich from time to time with something of a softer crust and in that traditional shape of sandwich bread. I do want to talk about the starter though, because I've had a lot of emails and messages about people whose starters aren't working right. So Sophia, if you can come in just a little bit. So this starter I fed this morning, and I normally would have used it an hour or two ago, but this is still fine. And even if it falls when you tap it, if it's just there, it's fine. If it goes any longer, it's going to be completely covered with bubbles, and it's going to be thinner than this. It's going to seem thinner, where this feels like, hopefully you can kind of get this impression. It's still stretchy. When you move it doesn't immediately fill in behind the spatula here. So if it's runnier than that, it needs to be refed. So I think that's one of the problems that I see. The other thing is, if it's not doubling, then it's really not ready. And you just need to either be patient or up the feeding schedule. So in those first few days, I know it's tempting to try to use your starter to make a loaf of sourdough, but if it's not ready, it's just going to be miserable for you, and then you'll get a bad taste in your mouth. I'm trying not to make food puns. So anyway, what we're doing is the same thing that you've seen me do before. Sophie and I are going to mix this stuff together. First, I'm going to measure out my sourdough. I'll leave the recipe in the comment section on the YouTube page. So we're just going to take care of that, and then we'll let it sit for half an hour to an hour. I had hoped to do all of this in one day, and I still do, but if the dough isn't cooperating because the house is maybe a little cooler and I can't get this in the oven before 9 o'clock at night, then we'll refrigerate it too. And we're going to talk about that too, because I've had some questions about refrigeration. So if you're just beginning with sourdough, use the sourdough when it's at its strongest, which is typically 4, 6, 7 hours after you feed it, and don't even mess with the refrigerator. Just keep feeding this every day until it looks like this. And then once you get it to this point, then the refrigerator is there to slow the process down, to slow this from feeding quickly so that you don't have to keep feeding it every day. That's the only reason I put my starter in the refrigerator. The only reason I put the final dough in the refrigerator is one of two reasons. Either A, I want it to be more sour, or I don't want to knead it. That's two reasons already. And then the third reason is like today. I went for a bike ride, I got back, it's later than I thought it was going to be. So I'm going to refrigerate it because I don't have time to bake it today. But I do want you to see when I actually stick it in the refrigerator, because I'm not going to do that right after I mix it. I'm not going to do that an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours. It's going to be quite a while. We'll talk about when to throw it in the refrigerator, but for now, we're going to make some bread. So I'm going to measure out 375 grams of this starter. It was about half of that. So when I refreshed my starter this morning, I knew that I needed 375 grams. So I obviously didn't add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. I added like 200 of each, and that got me enough to do this, and very importantly, enough to stick back in the fridge. So you never want to use up all of your starter, but the last note about that is, even if I had put all of this in and I only had like whatever this is, 8 or 10 grams, that's enough to refeed it. And so if you mix everything in and you go, oh my gosh, I used up all my starter, it's okay. As long as you haven't washed this bowl out, even just the tiny bit of stuff around the side of it is plenty. Somebody also asked me how often I worry about washing the bowls and stuff. When it gets crusty up here, then I tend to wash them. So I'll probably wash this one before I stick it back in the fridge today. And the easiest way to do that is just to have 2 of these. So I'll just transfer the whole thing, and then I'll wash it. I'm not too worried about it. They don't tend to get moldy. A lot of people hardly ever wash theirs, and so I mean, if you go a month of this going in and out of the refrigerator, it'll be fine. If you're just leaving it on the countertop, I'd probably wash it more frequently. Hey friends, we're back. And if you didn't notice, I'm in completely different clothes. And I'm in completely different clothes because I've decided to redo what we started yesterday. So Sophia and I recorded everything that we did, and the final bake was not what I wanted to see. So the bread was good. We had a piece of it this morning and it tasted fine, but it hadn't risen as much as I'd like, and I think there were a few different reasons for that. One is the single biggest reason is that I didn't follow the recipe that I had, and I didn't include the added ingredients that I don't normally use. So I added a tiny bit of sugar, a tiny bit of oil, and I left those out altogether. I definitely used too much kamut, so the bread didn't tend to rise as much. And so we're back, and I've mixed the sourdough starter along with the sugar and the oil and the water. That's about where we're different so far. So this has auto-leased for an hour, and now we're going to mix in the remaining flour that's mixed in with the salt, and then we'll continue from there. And we're gonna stop a couple times. I'm probably gonna hand knead this today. Sophia's been using the mixer for some cupcakes, and so I'm just gonna do what I said in the first video that I hardly ever do, which is to knead it by hand. So this dough, and I'll have the recipe right immediately following this segment, so when Sophia and I cut this, I'll splice in the recipe so you can see it. It's definitely drier than the artisan bread that we make, and we're going to treat it a little differently because we don't want that chewy crust. We don't want giant air pockets in the middle of it. So you'll see that as the time progresses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this out right about now, and I'm going to start kneading it by hand. And I do have a little extra flour in case I need it, but I don't actually think I will. So at this point, I'm just kind of continuing to fold it, and then I'm just going to start kneading it. Just making sure that I've got the remaining flour under here. And then we'll just let this roll for a second. Okay, so we're gonna let this sit just for about 5 more minutes, and then I'm gonna finish kneading it, and we'll record that too. Okay, we're back. Our director of photography had to go to an emergency kitten feeding. So I'd like to keep this nice and handy so that I can get a sticky loaf of dough or scrap of dough off the counter if I need to. And this is still a bit wetter than normal, than something like a baguette dough. But as you can see, that 5-minute rest did a lot of good. And so we'll try to keep the added flour to a minimum, but it is just a little stickier than I'd like. So one of the things that you'll read about is the windowpane test. And if you saw the 2 videos that we did on making pizza dough out of sourdough starter, when we actually started baking the pizzas, Sophia came over on this side, which she's going to do now, and we'll do the same thing that we did with the pizza dough, but instead of stretching this whole thing out into a loaf, what we're looking for is an indicator of gluten development, and this feels pretty good to me. I'm still going to knead it for a couple more minutes, but if we flour up a piece of this dough, we should be able to stretch it. It's a little harder with a really wet dough, but as we start to stretch this more, we should get to the point where we can stretch it without it breaking so much that we can actually see light through it. And that's the windowpane test. So I can keep stretching and stretching and stretching. And what we're hoping to avoid is that. So like I said, I'm gonna keep stretching this more, but that's the windowpane test. And so does this one pass it? Yeah. So we could stop kneading now, but I think that just by feel, I wanna give this one just a couple more minutes. And then we're gonna set it aside for its initial fermentation, if you don't count the auto leaves as the initial fermentation. And that's going to be 2 hours. After the first hour, I'm going to stretch and fold it anyway, just to keep developing the gluten, but we're not quite as worried about it with the sandwich loaf anyway. But I'll probably stop after an hour, or come back to this after an hour, and give it a stretch and fold. But we'll check it in at 2 hours just to see what it looks like, and then we're going to do the same thing at 3 hours. And probably at 3 hours from now, so 4 hours after the first mixing of the flour, sourdough starter, and water, and the other ingredients, we'll be ready to shape, I hope. Okay. So we're back, and it's been 2 hours, and I did one stretch and fold, and this rubber band marked the top of the dough, so I'm pretty happy with this, but I'm still going to do one more stretch and fold, and then I'm going to wait another hour, and then I'm going to actually pan these, and we'll leave them out for the final rise proofing. So I'm just going to take this out, hopefully in one nice piece. So it's definitely fluffier than it was, when we started. So I'm going to shape this into something like a square, and then stretch one side over, stretch the other side over, and then the same thing on these two sides. And then I'm going to put it, what was the bottom, side up. Okay, and at this point, we've got a little gap on either side, so I'm paying a little less attention to the rubber band at this point. But in another hour, we'll take it out, divide it in half, put them into greased pans, and then I'll skip that step. But we'll look at them right before we put them in the oven, because we'll treat the two of them differently. We'll brush some milk on one to allow for some expansion and enable the soft crust. And the other, I think we'll put an egg wash on top of, and maybe some sesame seeds or poppy seeds or something like that. So we'll be back. So we're back, and we're about ready to put these sourdough sandwich loaves in the oven. And I'm gonna bake them at 350. I'm gonna look at them at about a half an hour and see how they're doing. It'll probably go about 40 minutes. So we're gonna do two things differently. I'm kind of experimenting for you. The first loaf, we're going to, actually one of these we're just gonna brush with, this is a little bit of cream, and it will help keep the top of the loaf soft so that we won't get a really hard crust like we would want on an artisan loaf. Something like we would hope to get if we had baked this in the Dutch oven. We're also not adding steam. And then this other one, let me just wipe this off really fast. This other one we're gonna put an egg wash and some sesame seeds on, and then I'm gonna score it. I'm scoring it second because if I try to run the knife through it, it's gonna stick. So I'm gonna put an egg wash. This is just one beaten egg with the yolk and the white, and about a teaspoon of water, more or less. So we're gonna score it, and then I'm gonna actually brush the inside of this too. My substitute director of photography is telling me that I missed a spot. Did I get them all? Okay, so we're gonna give this a score. And I'm actually gonna turn it and do it again.
I give it a 98.
You're so silly. I should have grabbed the lom. I just thought, well, maybe if you don't have a razor blade in your house, I'll just do this. So we want a decent size score, and that's because we want to see the difference in expansion between these two. So now I'm just going to put a tiny bit of wash down the middle of that too. Okay, and then we'll put some sesame seeds on this, because why not? Okay, and with that, we're going to pop these in the oven. I put them in about the middle of the oven, and I do put a sheet pan underneath these so the bottoms of them don't burn, because my oven is way hotter in the bottom. If I put them too close to the top, then the tops will burn, because that's where all the heat goes. So these are going in, and then I will stick a sheet pan in, and we will come back in 40 minutes. Everyone, so this is the final product. So if you would come in a little closer, you can see that these two loaves are almost identical in how much they rose in the oven, so the oven spring. This is the one that we obviously put sesame seeds on, but this is the one that started with the egg wash, and then this is the one that we just brushed a little bit of cream on. And you see it really didn't have much of an effect that this one was scored versus this one that was not. Neither of them split a lot along the bottom or the sides, which is good. And what you can see is that, I hope, is that the top is nice and soft compared to, you know, the typical crusty artisan loaf, and that the inside, it does have irregular holes, but not nearly on the scale that you know, something that we would do with a higher hydration dough cooked in a Dutch oven or on the baking stone or anything would have. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. One is just the way that we handle the dough as we're you know, pushing a lot of the big bubbles out toward the end when we're shaping it. Some of it has to do with the fact that we you know, covered the tops of them in something, that they're cooked in loaf pans, that there wasn't a preheated stone that they were sitting on. Some of it has something to do with the things that we added, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of fat, and you can go crazy with that and increase both levels. But I would just recommend that, you know, if you want to make something that looks like Wonder Bread, it's going to take a bit of work, and you should get there slowly by adding some things. The one thing that we didn't add that would really soften up the crumb on these loaves is either powdered milk or regular milk instead of some of the water. So powdered milk or potato flakes, both of those will really tenderize the crumb a lot. I did not add either of those because I wanted something that I think will make a, you know, a good grilled cheese sandwich. And so if we're looking for something really soft, if you wanted to do something more sweet instead of savory, you can absolutely use sourdough. It doesn't have to be sour. We've made tons of desserts out of this using no wild yeast, or no instant or active dry yeast. And you know, the possibilities are endless. So be creative, start simple like this, and I don't think you can go wrong.